Getting a clear sense of what a culture is a challenge even when we have a lot of written documents, because documents tend to be written in most times and places in history by elites that reflect their own agendas and don't necessarily give us an accurate picture of society as a whole. So how much more difficult is it to reconstruct the nature of a society in the absence of written documents? How can we do that? How can we know how they lived and what they believed and how they interacted with each other, how they saw others? The two principal tools that we have for reconstructing prehistoric societies are archaeology on the one hand and historical linguistics on the other. So archaeology can provide us a record of the kinds of material objects that people used, and we can draw conclusions based on that. Although our conclusions are guesses, we should understand that. We might misinterpret what a given object might have been used for or what it might have signified. And in terms of historical linguistics, we can compare contemporary languages or languages which have a written record with each other and try to establish their genetic relationships to each other. Since many of these languages that we have access to today descended from a common ancestor, in the same sense that genealogy applies to living beings, it can apply to languages as well. They're living things which change over time and interact with their environments. By combining these two sets of analysis, we can try to overlay what we learn or can reconstruct through linguistic analysis, comparison of languages, terminology, and also mythologies. If we compare different mythologies that seem to have a common ancestor, we can project back in some cases to imagine that they reflect the ideas and values of a certain society at a certain place and time. And then we can compare that with the material objects that we find through archaeology. So the Iranian peoples that are the subject of this course are speakers of languages that are part of the broader family of languages that are called Indo-European languages. And they're called that because the languages today are spread all the way across Europe and into India. And they're not the only languages that are spoken in these regions, but they are spread throughout. And this reflects the idea that speakers of these languages are descended from people who had a common ancestor, that is originally one culture which existed at a certain place in time, and that different groups of these people split off and migrated to other parts of the world over time where they interacted with other peoples, and as a result their languages changed. Okay, so although we don't have any written documents in this proto-language, which we call Proto-Indo-European, the common ancestor to all the languages in the Indo-European family. We can reconstruct what this language probably was like by comparing the examples that we have of all the attested languages of this family. So if you look at this chart, you can see that that there's quite a few languages, some living, some not living anymore, which are all part of this Indo-European family. So we have the Germanic languages, which include English, German and Dutch, Swedish and Icelandic and so forth. We have the Slavic languages, Russian, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Serbo-Croatian, all these languages, Polish, Czech. We have Baltic languages. We have the Celtic languages, like Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Welsh, Breton, which are living languages still today. We have the Latin languages, French, Spanish, Italian, We have Albanian, which is a branch of its own. We have Hellenic, Greek being a branch of its own. Armenian, again, an Indo-European language, but a branch of its own. Anatolian languages, which none of which are spoken anymore, but which we do have ancient written documents in. Tocharian, which is one of the strangest, most outlying of the Indo-European languages, probably the first branch to break off maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, which was spoken in what's now Western China up until about 900,000 years ago. And we do have many written documents in those languages because they were they became Buddhist, and there are a lot of Buddhist texts in that language, those languages. And then we have Indo-Iranian, which is the common ancestor to languages spoken by the Iranian peoples, including Persian, Kurdish, Pashto, and Baluchi, which are languages that are spoken today. And then also the Indic branch of Indo-Iranian, lots of the languages spoken in the northern two-thirds of the Indian subcontinent. Okay, so that's where we place the Iranian languages here. So broadly related to the other Indo-European languages. And by the same token, because we have a lot of mythologies which are preserved in many of these languages, we can compare them, and we can sort of sift out the differences as presumably accretions later in time through historical events or interactions with non-Indo-European peoples, and whatever's left over, that common core, we imagine may represent the mythology, in other words, the cosmology, the worldview, the religious rituals of the original Proto-Indo-European peoples that they are all descended from. Okay, so we see here today, if we look at the Iranian languages, they are spoken over a very wide area from Turkey, the Kurdish and Zaza languages, which are southwestern Iranian languages, along with Gorani, which is a version of Kurdish, Luri, Persian, which is the most widely spoken Iranian language today. And then we have languages along the South Caspian, Mazandarani, Gilani, Talishi. In the Caucasus, we have the Tat language, which seems to be a dialect of the Middle Persian spoken in pre-Islamic times in southwestern Iran. It seems that people migrated from there to the Caucasus, and they preserved a very old form of Persian, which is still spoken today, mainly by Jewish communities there. And then we have in the Central Caucasus, we have Ossetian, which is interestingly, although it exists in the northwestern part of the Iranian world, it is a language that actually belongs to the northeastern branch because it's descended from the language of the Scythian nomadic tribes that roamed all across the steppes of Central Eurasia, but originated probably more in what's Central Asia here, and so that Ossetian is more closely related to the languages of the Northeast, the Pamiri languages. Here you have on the borders of Pakistan and China in the Pamir Mountains that are the northeastern Iranian languages. Southeastern Iranian languages like Pashto, and then we have Dari and Tajiki, which in fact are dialects of Persian. They're not separate, distinct languages from Persian. They're mutually comprehensible. And then down here we have in Oman, we have Kumzari, which is again descended from a very old dialect of Persian from pre-Islamic times, but is still spoken by people in this region of Oman up to the present day. All right, so through historical linguistics and archaeology, it is hypothesized that the ancestors of the speakers of various Indo-European languages, their original homeland was in the South Russian steppe, or the Pontic steppe as it's sometimes called, the region north of the Black and Caspian Seas and the Caucasus Mountains here. So the steppe region here, and probably going back 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Now, this is a somewhat arbitrary point in time because these people had a history prior to that, and they presumably came from somewhere else. So anytime we talk about origins, we're really going to be constrained to pick an arbitrary point in time and start there. And it makes sense, it's convenient to talk about Indo-European origins and place it 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in this particular region of southern Russia and eastern Ukraine, simply because the linguistic and archaeological evidence is strong enough that we can make a case to support this. If we go back earlier than that, the evidence becomes weaker and weaker, so that we're really just in the realm of guessing and supposition. So, for example, many linguists will say, well, there's a bigger language family that goes back earlier than Indo-European, and groups together the Indo-European and Semitic languages like Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, that these languages all had a common ancestor with Indo-European if you go back 8,000 or 9,000 years. But by that point, the evidence is so thin that, it might be a compelling argument, it might be an interesting argument, but you really can't prove it. Whereas if we stick to the time frame of 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in this particular region, the case is pretty convincing that these people were living here, and we have this on various evidence. Their vocabulary tells us a lot about their economy and their lifestyle and their social interactions. Again, we establish what the vocabulary was, 5,000, 6,000 years ago by comparing all the languages that descended from it and then seeing what they have in common. This can also tell us about where they live. So, for example, we see that the word for birch tree has cognates in practically all the Indo-European languages. And this suggests to us that there's an original Indo-European word for birch tree, which suggests that the speakers of that language lived in an area that had birch trees. If we say, on the other hand, that the word for palm tree is different in all of these languages, that suggests to us that it entered the vocabulary of the speakers of the various descendant languages at a later time when they moved to areas that had palm trees, and they'd say, oh, what's that? And they either invented a word for it, or they borrowed the word of the local people from their language of what that word was. And that helps us, that's how historical linguistics can help us to trace the movements of people, okay? But archaeology, gives us other information, and then we can compare the two. So archaeology gives us a record of different cultures that lived at different times, and we see certain objects that are characteristic of a particular culture. So if we go back 5,300 years or so ago, north of the Caucasus, we have this culture that archaeologists call the Yamnaya culture, and it's characterized by certain kinds of pottery and weapons and things like that that seem to represent a culture. And then we can see how that develops over time, right? You dig up other things which are similar but maybe more sophisticated from a later time, that are radiocarbon dated to later centuries. You say, okay, so these people moved and they also developed their technology. And we see it's more advanced, okay? And so we can follow and plot the movements of people. And then again, through historical linguistics and comparative mythology, we try to overlay one on the other and say, yeah, the people who produced this pottery probably spoke this kind of language, okay? And these are all guesses, but some guesses have more substance to them than others. And so through this process, we can pinpoint a time around 4,000 years ago, give or take a couple of centuries, located in this region in the southern Ural Mountains of modern-day Russia, Ural Mountains generally being considered to be the dividing line between Europe and Asia. So in the southern Ural Mountains, there is an archaeological complex that's referred to by archaeologists as the Sintashta Archaim complex, named after some contemporary locations that are there. And this complex shows us a distinctive culture that we can trace back to the earlier Yamnaya culture. It's more developed by the time it's established here, 1,000 some years later. And this material culture also shows us some indications that enable us to combine it or connect it with certain mythologies that we have attested later on. So, 1,000 years after this, we have myths of what we call Hindu myths, particularly the Rig Veda, which is the oldest surviving text in the Sanskrit language, which is a language of the Indo-Iranian branch of Indo-European languages, which we know from India, which tells us, well, the speakers of these languages, their ancestors moved from Central Asia. They migrated down into southern Asia sometime around 1500 BCE. Around 3,500 years ago, give or take a few centuries. If we look at the Rig Veda, for example, the earliest written version of which we have is from about the 8th century BCE. But like many important texts, especially religious texts, the written version seems to be preserving material that was actually composed very much earlier, at least 1,000 years earlier or more. And the Rig Veda seems to contain a lot of material that was probably composed by the people living in this Sintashta region in the southern Urals 4,000 years ago. And what's interesting is, just to give you one example, the Rig Veda talks about a ritual called the Asvamedha, which is a horse sacrifice. And we have burials from Sintashta from 4,000 years ago, which seem to be basically carrying out the details of how you're supposed to do the Asvamedha. 1,300 years later, we have a text in India which is talking about something which seems to have been done 1,300 years earlier, very, very far away in southern, what's now southern Russia. And then we can compare that with the oldest Iranian myths that we have, which are preserved in the Zoroastrian sacred text, the Avesta, which probably wasn't written down until 1,500 years or so ago. But again, preserving very, very ancient material going back probably 2,000 years prior to that. And again, we can compare the two and see that the oldest part of the Avesta, which is called the Gathas, and the oldest part of the Hindu Vedas, which is called the Rig Veda, they basically are describing the same cosmology. They have the same set of gods and demons, and they have, the same ideas about the universe and how it operates. What's different is that they have very, very different attitudes about how human beings should live in that universe and how they should do their rituals and whatnot. So we have a divergence between different members of this originally unified group that lived here in Western Siberia 4,000 years ago. As they migrate across the steppes during the second millennium before the Common Era, some of them branch off and cross over the mountains of Afghanistan and wind up in India, and others move into the plateau region south of the Caspian Sea, which comes to be Iran. Okay, so the Indo-Iranians split into the Indo-Aryans, as they're called, and mix with the indigenous peoples of India, who already have a very highly developed civilization, and they create a blend which results in Indian civilization as we've known it in history. And then we have another branch which goes off into what becomes Iran. And although these people did not have written texts until much later, historical linguistics and comparative mythology enables us to assume that they had a name that they used to refer to themselves even 4,000 years ago. They seem to have called themselves Arya, which in their language originally came from an Indo-European word meaning a member of our group, but by the time of the Indo-Iranians, it seemed to have acquired the meaning of noble people. The idea being, well, our group is noble, everybody else is savages, they're barbarians, they're no good. And the mythologies of these peoples reflect a very warlike pastoral nomadic society that depended very much on raiding their neighbors and stealing their livestock. Of course, stealing is a pejorative term in our language today, but in these myths, it's actually a very good and laudable thing to go and to liberate cattle, women, and other property from inferior peoples who don't deserve it, and to bring it back to your own group, which is noble. So these Arya or Aryans, as they seem to have called themselves, had a very distinctive self-identity, which survives right up to the present day. So Iran etymologically means the land of the Aryans. It's interesting that a form of the word also survives in the Ossetian language. Remember, the Ossets are people who live in the Central Caucasus today, and through a completely different historical trajectory of migrations, they have preserved the same notion that Ossets, in their own language, they call themselves Ir, which is descended from Arya, and they call their country Iriston, which is, again, like Iran, it's land of the Aryans. Okay, so the Ossets and the Persians are very distant cousins today, because they follow very different ancestries, which probably split more than 3,000 years ago, and yet they have both preserved this notion of an Aryan identity. And of course, that has been preserved in India as well, although very heavily politicized, and we don't have time to get into discussions about Aryan identity in the context of India or Hinduism. Okay, so here is a scene of the site of one of the archaeological sites in southern Russia, western Siberia. It's the Sintashta Archaeum complex. This is what it looks like today. So steppe regions, very flat, almost treeless, very harsh, cold winters, very short, hot, dry summers. So you see where they've begun some of the excavations. Here is a reconstruction of one of these sites at Archaim, dating from around 4,000 years ago. Although they were largely pastoral nomadic, some of them did build settlements. So we have here the reconstruction of a village from this region, which we associate with Indo-Iranian speakers living around 4,000 years ago. We have skeletal remains that have been reconstructed to give us an idea of what the faces of some of these people might have looked like. So you can see here, you start with the skeleton, and then you can start to fill in what that person probably looked like when they were alive. And here is an artist's impression of how their horse-drawn chariots might have looked. Now, these people, they were, as I said, warlike and aggressive. They thrived on raiding others, and they had a couple of distinct advantages. One was that they had developed this wheeled chariot, which was horse-drawn, and they used not just for transport for themselves, but for battle. So if you're on foot, you're at a huge disadvantage trying to fight with somebody who is able to maneuver around quickly from the vantage point of this horse-drawn chariot. And as a result, we see that in the mythologies of peoples who had developed this technology, the chariot has a sacred significance. You can think of Apollo in Greek mythology being drawn across the sky by a chariot. And we see many depictions of chariots in petroglyphs, for example, at sacred sites across Eurasia. You can think of, if you know the Bhagavad Gita, the scene in the Mahabharata where the hero Arjuna is about to go into battle, and the god Krishna is his chariot driver, and Krishna is explaining to him why it's his duty to go into battle. So this is reflective of this aspect of the culture as well. As a result, the burials from these sites reflect that, for them, a horse-drawn chariot was a sacred thing. So this human has been buried here, and he's been buried along with his chariot and the horses which drew the chariot. And we have a lot of examples of these all the way across the Eurasian steppe, basically from Bulgaria as far as Korea. Because these were people that ranged far and wide. They were the most mobile people on Earth. You could say up until the invention of the train in the 19th century. So that enabled the spread, and that's clearly why Indo-European languages are more widely spread across the world than languages from any other language family. You see another example here of chariot burials. These burials were done under earthen mounds, which are called kurgans. Which again are found all the way across the Eurasian steppe. So, we can begin about 4,000 years ago to talk about a distinctly Aryan culture within the broader Indo-European culture, because it has features which are specific to the Aryan branch of Indo-Europeans, features which we can detect from, again, historical linguistics and comparative mythology. And what we see is that throughout the second millennium BCE, from about 4000 BCE till about 3000 BCE, these peoples migrated. Why did they migrate? The best guess is probably climate change. Again, the steppes are a very harsh environment. And probably, the winters just got a little too cold, the summers got a little too hot. The Zoroastrian Avesta talks about the original homeland as being a place that had 10 months of winter and 2 months of summer. Also in the Avesta, hell is described as a place that is very, very cold. It's not a place of fires the way it is in the Christian Islamic traditions, but a place that's very, very cold. So these people probably knew a lot or remembered a lot about how much you suffer when it's really, really cold. Anyway, they migrated, and they began to migrate eastwards as far as Mongolia, the Altai Mountains here. And we have many sites in the Altai Mountains here which are associated with Iranian speaking cultures of the Bronze Age. In general, this period, this culture is referred to by, it was given the name by Soviet archaeologists, Andronova culture. And Andronova is generally considered to be an Aryan-speaking culture. And we have no written documents, so we can only just sort of compare later texts like the Avesta, like the Rig Veda, and see what they have in common and project it back into the past and say, okay, probably the people who lived, in the second millennium, they probably saw the world in this particular way. They probably had these kinds of rituals. And the only kind of material culture that really enables us to corroborate that is that they left a lot of petroglyphs. They left tens of thousands of rock drawings at sites all the way across Eurasia, but there are particularly large numbers in what's now Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which date to this period, and we try to interpret these images based on the other information that we have that can maybe help us understand what was going on, what these sites were used for, and in many cases they seem to have been ritual sites. So one particular site that I have visited in southern Kazakhstan is called Tamgali, and I'll show you some images from there and talk about how archaeologists have tried to interpret these images from more than 3,000 years ago that are attributed to this, we could say, proto-Iranian people, whose descendants then moved into the Pamir Mountains here, what's now Tajikistan and Afghanistan, across Afghanistan into the Indus Valley region and into India. Others moved into what's now Iran, and in the meantime encountered a rather highly developed settled urban agricultural civilization, which was not Indo-European, which archaeologists have called the Bactria-Margiana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC for short. Others call it simply the Oxus civilization, because this river, which is now called the Amu Darya, was called by the Greeks the Oxus River. So a very advanced civilization in the second millennium BCE that had urban structures and developed agriculture and was trading with Mesopotamia and also trading with India, and then again trading with the steppe nomadic peoples as well. So they're interacting here. So if we look at, these kind of interactions are preserved in language. So for example, if we look at the Persian language today, what's spoken in Iran, linguists have identified a number of words that are not linguistically Iranian, which they theorize were absorbed into the Iranian language 3,000 years ago or so as a result of their contact with the BMAC civilization, reflecting aspects of culture that the Iranians adopted from them. So for example, the word for camel, the Iranians apparently discovered camels for the first time when they came into this part of the world. The word for brick, the Iranians didn't build with bricks, they built with wood when they built at all, or felt or whatever, skins. So the word for brick is supposedly borrowed from the BMAC language. By the way, we have no idea what the BMAC people spoke. It wasn't Indo-European, but they didn't leave any texts, or they might have. There are some inscriptions which nobody's deciphered, so we don't know if that's reflecting their language or not. But they had a lot of cultural similarities with the peoples of southern Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley region, showing that they were very much in contact with them. Okay, so this was a huge transformational event in the history of the Iranian peoples, because the Iranians, who were steppe dwellers, nomadic, pastoral nomads, very patriarchal and warlike, came into contact with this much more developed civilization in Central Asia, with which they assimilated. They dominated them. They came to rule them, which is why Iranian languages came to be dominant here from about 2,500 years ago or so, maybe longer. But they mixed with the local peoples. So the local peoples lost their language, but again, some words perhaps preserved. Wheat seems to have been first domesticated here. So the word for wheat, again, is said to be a BMAC word that was borrowed into Iranian languages at that time. Okay, so here we are at Tamgali in southern Kazakhstan, and so you've got this kind of gully here, and then you've got these rocks over here on the left. And what's interesting is these rocks have thousands of petroglyphs on them, which has suggested to archaeologists that this gully was used as a sacred site. And in particular, right around here, there's a little indentation which seems to have been used as a kind of altar. Or so the idea is that these nomadic peoples who were living here maybe 3,300 years ago, which is about the time that the oldest petroglyphs are dated to, that they used this as a sacred site for rituals. And because a lot of the petroglyphs have to do with animals and hunting, hunters here, it's assumed that they did rituals prior to going out on the hunt. And this might have involved dressing up in animal skins, pretending to be animals, praying to animals to give themselves to the hunter. I mean, we know from other hunter-gatherer types of societies that the kinds of rituals that even today some of them still perform before going out on the hunt, and we guess maybe they did things similar to that. So we have more, hunting scenes, but then we have this very weird figure here, and there are a lot of these weird figures with big heads. So we don't know if these are meant to represent superhuman figures, maybe gods that are prayed to ensure success in the hunt, or maybe they're shamans, because we know that shamans often wear headgear, animal headgear, or some other kind of headgear during the rituals. We don't really know what that's depicting. Here you have another example of you've got the hunter here, and you've got the hunter's dog here. Many depictions of dogs out on the hunt helping. And then here we have pictures of dancing. And again, you've got this figure with the strange thing on his head. Again, we don't know if it's a divine figure or whether it's a shaman. So we know that they did these ecstatic dances before, well, as part of their rituals. So it might have been for different kinds of rituals. They might have had different dances. We also know through a comparison of texts such as the Avesta and the Rig Veda that these rituals involved the consumption of hallucinogenic drugs. There is a substance known in Sanskrit as soma, and in Avestan as hauma. It's obviously the same thing. And there's been a lot of speculation of what that drug was or how they made it, but it was clearly one of the most important rituals that the priests performed was how to prepare this hallucinogenic drug, which was probably consumed as a beverage in most cases, although we know later on the Scythians inhaled hemp by burning hemp seeds while sitting in a tent, and they would become intoxicated in that way. But in any case, it had a religious function. Here we have one of these very strange figures with all these dots, and this seems to be maybe kind of a solar figure. Some Russian archaeologists have suggested that this may be a depiction of the Indo-Iranian god Mitra. Mitra was a very important deity, clearly going back to earliest times. The word mitra literally means spoken contract, and in a society that had no central government, no institutions, no police force, the only thing that could keep any kind of social order or stability was spoken oaths, spoken contracts. If people kept their word, then things would stay, things would stay stable. But if people started breaking their word, then society could fall apart. So this was very, very important. So Mitra was the god that ensured that people kept to their oaths. And it's said in the Avesta that Mitra had 1,000 eyes and 10,000 ears, and he would see you and hear you no matter what you did. And if you broke your word, then Mitra would be the one to punish you for that. So some archaeologists have suggested that these kind of polka dot image here, that may be meant to evoke Mitra's 1,000 eyes. It's just a guess. There could be other explanations for it. But again, you have a similar thing here. Again, all these dots on the head of this figure, and then you have these dancers down here. And then you've got the animals here. So again, this is probably depicting something to do with the hunt. And you have this other figure here also with a kind of solar looking thing. And we do know that in later mythology that Mitra is a god that's associated with the sun. So that's another reason that some have guessed that these might be depictions of Mitra, and even Mitra could have been the most important deity of the ancient Indo-Iranians. You get yet another depiction of a figure with strange, lots and lots of dots, and then another one over here. Okay, and then yet another form. This again seems to be rather solar image here. Another one here, kind of looking ahead, that looks like it's in flames. And then perhaps a priest. Here we have an image of two priests, we assume, facing each other, or two people. They have raised their arms. We assume that that's in prayer. They also have erections. Not quite sure how to interpret that, but there seem to be other images which suggest here we have image of two people having sex, from behind. We don't know if it's a man and a woman or two men. We don't know if this is part of a religious ritual, or connected perhaps with fertility. It also could have to do with domination, could have to do with subjugating defeated enemies. It's really difficult to interpret this, but since it exists in what is assumed to be a sacred site, it probably has some religious meaning. Now, if we move a little further to the southeast, and a few centuries later, we come to a site in what's now Western China, but it's on the borders of Tajikistan, and the inhabitants are Iranian speakers who are called Tajiks, although they're linguistically different from the Tajiks of Tajikistan. But they are promoted by the Chinese government as China's only European ethnic minority. So they are a European people living in the western part of China, who speak an Iranian language. And in this region, we have a very interesting site from about 2,500 years ago. Now these people were clearly descended from Iranian-speaking nomads from Central Asia who settled here sometime during the first millennium BCE. And they have left this site, which only recently archaeologists have started to try to interpret. And what we have here is a number of black and white lines, okay? And you might think at first glance it's some kind of agriculture, but it's not. These lines are created by the careful laying out of black stones and white stones in alternation. So they're lines, and presumably they're pointing at something. And we assume that they have a sacred meaning because there are burials here as well. So we see, if you see close up, black stones, white stones, black stones, white stones. And here we have the kinds of burials that are located here. So and so what is interesting is that a Chinese colleague working in Beijing has been working on this site for a number of years. He, working on the assumption that this had some sacred meaning, he assumed that maybe that these lines are pointing at something. So he did some calculations to find out what they're pointing at. And what he found out was that these lines are all pointing at locations on the horizon where the sun would set or rise at a particular date in the year. So this seems to be a kind of ritual calendar, which presumably was used so that they could calculate the times to do certain rituals during the year, which of course is exactly the same function that Stonehenge had in England. So while this site is very, very poorly understood, has not been very thoroughly studied so far, I think it makes sense to refer to it as something like a Scythian Stonehenge. Now we talked about kurgans, which are characteristic of this nomadic culture. Kurgans are basically burial mounds. Kurgan is a Turkish word borrowed into Russian. We don't know what the people originally called them, but you see these dotting the steppes all the way across Eurasia, all the way again from the Balkans all the way to Mongolia and to as far as Korea. You can see these kinds of kurgans, which were burial sites for the elites, and they would be buried along with their horses, their chariots, their jewelry, maybe food, clothes, things that they would need in the afterlife, and of course women. So we'd have wives or concubines that presumably would have been killed so that they could be buried along with the male who is for whom the kurgan is constructed. You've got another example here. So if you once you get a sense of what they look like, you see there everywhere. There's one here. There's one here. There's one here. This is a skeleton that is actually a female skeleton, which was exhumed from the Altai Mountains, but it's actually very well preserved. You can still see tattoos here. This is people that they were very into tattooing their bodies, and so again, presumably a member of these Scythian Iranian-speaking nomadic tribes that reached as far as the Altai Mountains during the first millennium BCE. And in the same region, which is called Pazyryk, which is in southern Siberia, south central Siberia, we have here, this is a felt image of a horseman showing something about what the clothing would have looked like. And this has been very well preserved because it was frozen in permafrost and was only dug out in the 20th century. We also have the world's oldest example of a knotted pile carpet, the so-called Pazyryk carpet. What's interesting is that this carpet was almost certainly woven at a considerable distance away from the Altai Mountains. It's theorized that it came either from Iran or from Central Asia, what's now the region of Uzbekistan, but very, very far away from the Altai Mountains, reflecting trade. Carpets, of course, were always a very important part of the lives of nomads because they're the piece of furniture that is easiest to carry. You simply roll it up and you put it on the back of your horse or your camel or whatever, and you can transport it. And that remains true right up to the present day. So yurts that nomads live in, they're covered, their floors covered with carpets, and even in urban environments in Iran today, the middle and lower classes in particular that are not as westernized as the upper classes, carpets may be the only furniture that they have in their houses or their apartments. Everything is, life is carried out living on the floor, sleeping on the floor, eating on the floor, whatever, but you'll always have a knotted pile carpet to make it comfortable. This is clothing that was dug up from one of these kurgan burials in southern Kazakhstan, not far from the city of Almaty that's been in the news recently with the riots and whatnot. And it's a very elaborate gold embroidered outfit, obviously was owned by, well, obviously the person who's buried in it must have been very powerful, wealthy individual. This, of course, wouldn't have been used as battle gear. This was almost certainly for ceremonial purposes, but it's called they call it the Scythian Golden Man. And what's interesting here is that you don't see the face, and the Kazakh authorities have at least been sensible enough to keep this out of the raging controversies and arguments throughout Central Asia over the ethnic the ethnicity of the peoples, of the prehistoric peoples of this region, because these countries are mostly now Turkic speaking, and since the fall of the Soviet Union, been involved in nation building, identity building projects which have focused on celebrating Turkic identity, and this has led many to claim that these regions were always inhabited by Turks, even as far as Azerbaijan and the Caucasus. They claim that this region was always Turkish, which the overwhelming evidence is that that's not true. We know that the Turks migrated from further to the northeast and only started to penetrate into Central Asia about 2,500 years ago, and have been engaged in an ongoing process of assimilation with Iranians and other peoples ever since then, with the Turkish language coming to predominate, basically pushing out the Iranian language from areas where it was formerly spoken. But of course, language is not necessarily the same thing as DNA. So there are a lot of people in Central Asia and the Caucasus that are almost certainly descended from ethnic Iranians, but who now speak Turkish and are considered ethnic Turks. So this is quite a controversy. But at least when they were putting this exhibit together in the museum in Kazakhstan, they did not put facial features, which would have, they would have had to choose whether they're going to put Asiatic features or European features, and they would have infuriated lots of people, whichever choice they would have made. Here in the same museum, you have a horse reconstruction showing, again, what would have been ceremonial gear. You wouldn't have gone into battle, probably, with the horse adorned like this, but you might have dressed the horse like that for ceremonial occasions. And then finally, if we go back to Ossetia and the Caucasus, the Ossets are the most direct descendants of all the Iranian peoples today from the ancient steppe peoples. They followed a different historical trajectory, which meant that their ancestors were never subjected to the transformations that were brought by Zoroastrianism or later on by Islam. And in fact, the Ossets remained mainly pagan right up until modern times, and to this day, their traditions are mostly what could be considered pagan, although they're mostly nominal Christians. So in Ossetia, national identity very much is tied up with this nomadic warrior heritage, and so you see images like this all over the country, in every shop, and out in public and in people's homes. This notion that they're descended from these nomadic warriors, very, very important. It's very present in their popular culture, in their literature, in their cinema, and in their ceremonies. So what you see here evoked is kind of ceremony which involves eating and drinking, feasting. And this is something that is very, very present in the Ossetian mythological corpus known as the Nart epic, of which you read an example for this week. Which again, preserving oral literature going back thousands of years, but not written down in this case until the 19th century. So very, very recently, and very, very little known even to other Iranian peoples. They mostly don't know about the Nart stories, but for Ossets, this is the central feature of their ethnic identity. Indeed, many aspects of Ossetian culture today are found in the Nart stories and probably go back to prehistoric times, the Scythians and other Iranian-speaking nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppes. So we have here, for example, this three-legged table, which is called a thing, and then we have three pies, pies which contain meat or cheese or beetroot or various things, and it's got a cosmological meaning. The heavens, the earth, and the underworld And then you have this cup, which is called the Watsamanga or Nartamanga, which is a cup of wine, usually. Can also be beer or vodka or something else. But the ritual meal involves consumption of large amounts of alcohol. And we know from going back to Herodotus and other Greek writers, and as well as ancient Persian writers and Chinese writers, that these steppe nomads were not just taking hallucinogenic drugs, but also very, very heavy drinkers. So alcohol plays a big part in their social life and their rituals, and that's true even today as well. An interesting story about this sacred cup is that the warriors would gather after a raid and they would compare, who killed the most enemies. And this cup would detect the liars from the truthful. So whoever is telling the truth about how many enemies they killed, the cup would magically rise to their lips, whereas it would flee from the lips of anyone who lied about how many people they killed. And this is reflecting a ceremony which is described in Herodotus. So, going back 2,500 years, Herodotus describes this ceremony going on amongst the Scythians. So that's, in short, an overview of some of the evidence we have for prehistoric ancestors of the Iranian peoples, and in some cases, how some of these cultural elements have survived even up to the present day.